quick. Okay, so I'm Alex with On Point TC, and today we're going to be doing Residential Purchase Agreement Part 2. It is October 6, 2021, roughly about 6:01. There are 22 slides on this presentation. Last week, we'll do some review from last week. It actually is on the presentation. I'm not an attorney or an accountant, so please take any of these presentations as a grain of salt. These are my opinions in terms of, my review and reading of the contracts. And, you can come up to your own opinion about things, or you can consult with an attorney or maybe your broker. And you can also research some of these things. There's a lot of information on the CAR website concerning everything that we're talking about here. So they do a lot of consulting on video as well as narratively on their website. So know that that's a resource. Okay. So why don't we get started? It just flipped over to 6:02. Today we'll be doing part 2, like as I mentioned, of the residential purchase agreement. So there's my information. Excuse me. And as always, if you wouldn't mind muting on your side, which you all are at the moment, just try to avoid background noise, any possible distractions. But as I always say, I do like a dialogue. I don't like to do a monologue necessarily, even though this is a presentation. But if you guys have a question or comment, feel free to chime in, or you can always throw a question on the chat. I try to get to the questions after every slide, okay? So that said, you can use the chat room, okay? And thank you guys for logging in early. I do appreciate that. It gives us an opportunity to get done, hopefully by 7:30. I try to get done in an hour and a half, so I'm not taking up too much time of the evening, okay? And as always, feel free to invite whoever you think might benefit from these presentations. And I am doing a recording of these presentations, so at some point there will be a channel up of all the presentations, so you can watch them at your leisure. This particular presentation, I did put up, or am doing these 6 parts to the RPA, mainly because I want to have some retroactive perspective, because the new RPA is going to be coming out in December of this year, and we can look back and we can look at the old contract and see the contrast, see what changed and why. Okay, so I thought it would be good to do these 6 now to get them out of the way. Okay, so that said, let's get started. Any questions or comments? All right, let's keep moving here. So part 2, introduction and overview. Okay, so part 1, we went over what we must first understand. What is it that we do as licensed agents, right? This presentation has been separated into 6 parts, designed to separate each day training. This part is part 2 of 6. Part 1 included the agency disclosure, the PRBS, the WFA, the BIA, the trust advisory, the REO, or real estate owned advisory, the short sale addendum, and the California Consumer Privacy Act advisory. That's what we went over last week, okay? And as always, guys, I use acronyms to make it easy because everything else is somewhat of a mouthful. So any questions or comments on last week? All right, so part 2, introduction. In part, we will venture into what an offer is and the tools we use to give your client proper representation. We will cover the many different types of purchase agreements. We will focus on the one that is mainly used by most agents in the industry, the RPA, which is the one we mostly see. But purchase agreements can be more specific. Give me 1 second, I'm sorry. Ray, I'm sorry, right in the middle of training. Yeah, so let me let you go. All right, sorry about that, guys. But purchase agreements can be more specific. It is important to know that they at least exist. Now, sometimes we come across some of these types of transactions, so just know that there is such a thing, okay? This is typically just a narrative contract that anyone can just write up, and I've seen them before. They're called letter of intent. A lot of times you see them just in an email, right? But Sometimes you see them maybe as a PDF, okay? The commercial property purchase agreement, right? The condominium conversion. So this would simply be what used to be apartments, and they're converting them into subdivision of airspace or condominium, right? The new construction purchase agreement, notice of default, probate purchase agreement, income property purchase agreement, and then of course the residential purchase agreement. And I'm assuming you guys can see the screen. For some reason my frame went away. You guys can see the screen okay? I'm assuming. Okay, so let's go to the definition, right? What is an offer? Present or something for someone to accept or reject as so desired. Put forward, proffer, provide, give, present, come up with, suggest, extend. So these are all synonyms, right, to what an offer is. Okay, so an expression of readiness to do or give something if desired, right? Proposal, proposition, suggest, submission, approach, overture. So an offer is, in real estate, is thorough communication that includes price, terms, and conditions that specifically covers any of the issues that come up. And sorry, I got some logging in here. Offers can have additions such as addendums, modifications such as requests, and even extensions as in time. We will cover the forms needed to come or to make these changes in future presentations. Okay, so in terms of what an offer is, it's simply a proposal, but ultimately it's the entire offer, what we're used to in terms of a purchase agreement that covers all the price, terms, conditions, and timeframes, right, in that proposal. So one could say an offer is simply just the price, but it's much, much more than that, okay? So over time, some of us have seen a one-page offer turn into 10 pages, and that's primarily because of legalities. So any questions or comments on that? So other types of purchase agreements, so letter of intent, right? Sometimes capitalized, right, in legal writing, but only when referring to a specific document under discussion, is a document outlining one or more terms between two or more parties before the agreement are finalized. Now, typically you would call a letter of intent still is a purchase agreement, okay, but a letter of intent typically is not in format, meaning that you're not getting a form and then using the form as your purchase agreement. Really, what a letter of intent is you're writing it out. So you happen to know what the price is going to be, how long you're going to take to close escrow, whether or not the property is going to be vacant, whether or not you have inspection rights, whether or not, you know, and on and on and on. So you can literally write it on an email. So it can be the subject of an email, so the body of the email. That could be a letter of intent, or you can write it on a Word document. It's still considered an offer. It just doesn't have all the legalities that we're used to seeing in our RPA or our car form RPA, right? So commercial property agreement covers an offer on a property that is designated as commercial property, otherwise not residential. It differs in that it covers other terms, issues, and conditions that are unique to commercial property. So if you have a mixed-use property or you have a commercial property, this purchase agreement would be appropriate to write an offer on for your buyer. Then we have the condominium conversion. A condominium is otherwise known as subdivision of airspace. When an apartment owner wishes to convert each of the units into a project to a condominium, this purchase agreement is used for each unit during the conversion. Once the entire project conversion is complete, the RPA would then be used, the purchase agreement, instead of the condominium purchase agreement or the conversion purchase agreement. Okay, so we all understand that an apartment building can be converted into condominiums. It does require the municipality or the city to get involved in that, mainly because now you're creating legal residences out of apartments. And I've actually seen this done. As a matter of fact, here in Whittier on Pioneer, I think it's Pioneer Boulevard or Pioneer Avenue, right there, right off the 605, there was a condominium conversion. And for those of you who know use codes, typically use code for a condominium is O10C in Los Angeles County. And you'll know that it was a conversion if it says O10E as the use code. So that's just something to, a little nugget there for those of you that get into the public records and understand the use codes for the different counties. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have a buyer that's interested in what's up and coming condominium from an apartment, this would be the appropriate purchase agreement. Any questions or comments on that slide? All right, so the new construction, and now we'll allow you to guess, but yes, the purchase agreement addresses property that has never been used. New construction is unique as in it typically includes warranties similar to what you would find in new cars. The verbiage included protects both parties in such a purchase. So yeah, in a new construction purchase agreement, you're going to find additional items that have to do with things that we would normally put off in terms of, inspection, warranties, home warranties, that kind of thing, right? It's gonna have some additional verbiage. So if you're caught up in a situation where, let's just say that the typically in a new construction site, there's usually a sales office. Typically, they would have their own purchase agreement, but let's just say that they don't. You can use this purchase agreement, or you may prefer to use this purchase agreement, maybe because you like the verbiage on it, but I just want to let you guys know that it exists, right? Notice of default purchase agreement, right? This purchase agreement has verbiage necessary in addressing property that has notice by a lien holder to foreclose. The verbiage is used to address a third party in the transaction, which is found to be necessary in making a decision, as most of the time they are forgiving debt that is owed, but not always, not necessarily a short sale. Okay, so there very well could be a situation where there's a notice of default, but the property has equity. So, instead of losing the property, the owner wants to sell the property. So it's not necessarily a short sale, so you wouldn't necessarily use the short sale purchase agreement, which there is one that exists, okay? You would use the notice of default purchase agreement. Again, it has different verbiage in it that applies to that situation, right? So probate purchase agreement is when a homeowner passes away and did not properly prepare transfer of title to next of kin. The process of probate is through the court system and requires certain verbiage to buyers and sellers in terms of an agreement. It is very specifically addressed the possibilities of longer timeframes, possible auction and court process of appraisal. Okay, so there happens to be, you happen to be looking at MLS, and one of your prospective buyers finds a property that they're interested in, happens to be a probate, and they'll market it that way. This is the purchase agreement that you would use. And again, it's just the different verbiage that's in the PPA versus the RPA. There is some verbiage in there concerning court approval, whether or not the administrator of the probate has, or needs court approval. And there are some other additional items in there. So who can tell me, just kind of briefly, how does one avoid probate? Anybody? How does somebody avoid probate? Let's say I own a property, I pass away, my family, and I know Larry's going to chime in on this one. Okay,
I'm waiting just to see. There's no big deal. Keep going.
I actually, well, Larry, I know you know, but here's the thing. Celia said it, Karen said it, and okay, so Robert and Sully, a will actually does not do anything for probate. Okay, so trust is one of the only ways, right, that you can avoid probate. There is another one. It's called a time of death deed, And I'll let Larry chime in on that one.
That's the odd that you're talking about.
Time of death deed.
Odds.
There was a deed that came out, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago that the California started to recognize. I know title companies don't like it, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So Celia, you said joint tenancy. Now, obviously, if somebody is in joint tenancy and one of the parties, unfortunately passes away, right, and the other party is still alive, then yeah, there is no probate. But then again, you're also not selling the property necessarily. So understand that when we're talking about probate, we're only talking about one person, right? If there is a single individual that owns property, and the only way to avoid probate would be to put that property in a trust. Obviously, if there's another person that owns the property, then and that person doesn't pass away, then there's no need to sell the property. And it has a clause in it called right of survivorship, right? So to answer your question, I mean, yeah, that is a way to avoid probate, but that's kind of like understood, okay? But I kind of wanted to mention that mainly because there is such a thing as a probate purchase agreement, and if you get caught up in that situation where you are going to put an offer on a probate, this would be the proper form. Now, I did mention the time of death deed. An individual that doesn't have a trust can write a deed, and really what it's doing is it's putting the beneficiary there, and at the time of death, as long as they produce a death certificate, the title can be transferred to that person without probate. That's the only other way to avoid probate. Now, the reason why I say title companies don't like it is because a lot of those deeds come back as non-recorded. You have to record the deed while the person's alive, obviously. You can't record a deed when the person already passed away. The title companies will not insure that property. I mean, I'm not a title rep, right? Larry probably has some horror stories about that, but at the end of the day, time of death deed needs to be recorded while the person is still alive. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, there are times when attorneys forget to put stuff in a trust or forget to record things, but it's all on a case-by-case basis, and it has to be like a slam dunk because there's a lawsuit waiting if anybody objects. So there's a whole litany of things you do.
Yeah. So that said, I won't get too involved in that, but I just want to let you guys know that that is the two different ways to avoid probate. One of them is a trust, and the other one would be time of death deed. Okay. Any other questions or comments on that? All right, let's move along. So other types of purchase agreements. So the residential income purchase agreement addresses property that includes tenants in possession of property as well as income producing. Both issues are specifically addressed in the RIPA, which appears very similar to the RPA as a whole. This agreement can be used for 1 to 4 units, as single-family residence could also be income producing. If your buyer is purchasing a non-owner occupied intent that has current leases and tenancy, the RIPA may be the right form for you. So this is a form that some of us are familiar with. We've used it, for duplexes. And like I said, you can use it for single family if it happens to be rented out. And you can also use the RPA, as long as you just remember that there are other issues, tenant in possession and deposits and tenant estoppels and that kind of thing. Some of that stuff is not in the RPA. So you just have to remember to add that stuff. And then finally, the agreement that we use mostly, the California Residential Purchase Agreement, I believe that this agreement can be used for any other of the agreements we went over today, but would need additional addenda. This is why most agents can get away with using the RPA for pretty much anything. They find themselves writing addenda to compensate certain issues and contract criteria that is necessary to discuss. Right? So understand that the RPA almost is kind of like the stripped down version of all the other ones. because the other ones now are adding things just based on the criteria of what it is that's being purchased. So we find ourselves using the RPA for some income properties, for some commercial properties, for possible notice of trust deeds, that kind of thing. And so what happens is that you start having to adding things because as you're going through it, something comes up, right? And so just know that you guys have now been exposed to the fact that these other kinds of purchase agreements exist, and you can use them for your transactions that come up, right? So in the following slides, we will be going over line by line the purpose, definition, and use of the residential purchase agreement, right? So let's get started. So a lot of you have asked me, hey, when are we going to start the RPA? Well, here it goes, guys. This is where we get started. And excuse me for a second. I'm going to mute myself. Oh, excuse me. Oh my goodness. I get a sneezing spell like once a day, and odd that I get one right now. But anyway, I hope you guys had the opportunity to read this funny. I thought it was pretty good. No, dear, I said I was going to buy you a big, proper tea. Instead, he's looking at the current listings in the area. Pretty funny. All right, guys, take it easy. Take it easy. My funnies aren't all that great, but okay. So, of course, guys, date prepared. I mean, probably one of the most important terms and criteria of this contract, because that date goes on your contingency removal, it goes on any of your addenda, some of your disclosures, it goes on a lot of different things. And it's mainly because when did we start this whole offer situation, right? We put in the buyer's information, right? There's the assessor's parcel number. Remember it's 3 sets of numbers, book, page, and parcel. You can find that on the public record information. We're writing in the purchase price, and if you're using zip forms, if you put the number in, it'll write the amount in there for you, right? Now here's something that I came across recently, right? In section D, the close of escrow, right, shall occur on, and then it has a box, and you can put the date as to when the closing date should be, or there's another option where you can put the number of days after acceptance. So you can say 35 days after acceptance. Let me tell you what this line doesn't say, and some of you guys might want to put this in your contracts, okay? Because some escrow companies are a little touchy about this. Some sellers are a little touchy about this. Some buyers are a little touchy about this. So let me tell you what they're touchy about. Closing early. So who can tell me what, if I'm putting in a date or a number of days after acceptance, who can tell me I pretty much have to close on that day specifically, right? And a lot of times we're waiting around a few days because docs have been signed, the loan is funded, and everybody's saying, hey, why don't we just close? So some of you might want to write, here's a little nugget. Some of you might want to write on or before, and then you could put 35 days after acceptance. So you write that on a counteroffer. So section 1D, escrow to close, or shall occur on or before 35 days after acceptance. Or you could possibly even write it in there. I don't know that it would go in there, but the computer might let you write it. But there's just a little nugget that I recently just came across, mainly because we had a problem with the escrow. The escrow didn't want to close because it didn't say on or before. It says it's 35 days after acceptance. So it falls on a date. So just so you guys know, okay, so section 1E, guys, is probably one of the most important things, because all of us agents think that we have the right to make decisions on our contracts, okay? So buyer and seller are referred to as the parties. And then here's the big one. Brokers are not parties to this agreement. What does that mean, guys? That you do not make decisions. You don't have any say. Doesn't matter what you think. None of it. So I have agents right now that insist that they can say and do whatever they want. And I'm telling them, no, I'm sorry, sir. this is an agreement between buyer and seller, and unless the buyer and seller, and I have an executed document saying whatever their sentiment is, and I can actually deliver that to escrow, doesn't matter what you say. And just to kind of give you a quick example, I had an agent, a selling agent, come into escrow and want a reduction in price for the escrow fees. And I told the agent, I said, well, you can't do that for two reasons. Number one, because you're not a party to this agreement. And number two, you put seller's choice of escrows on the contract. And guess what? That was an agreement between buyer and seller. So guess what, Miss Agent? You cannot make those decisions. Now, as a selling agent, what should she have done? What she should have done is she should have negotiated that before she wrote the offer. Simple, guys. Simple. This is where you do have some power. Negotiate that before you write the offer. Hey, what are the escrow fees that you're gonna if we're gonna let the seller choose the escrow, what are the fees, right? And if I don't like the fees, hey, guess what? I have a better company that will charge us, instead of $1,500, they'll charge us $1,000. Is that okay with you, Mr. Agent and Mr. Seller? Yeah, that's fine. Okay, then I'm gonna put that in the offer. So guess what? The offer is gonna say escrow to be, and then they're going to decide the escrow. But guess what? I just negotiated that, and I no longer have to worry about this, because if you come across somebody like me who knows the rules, I'm not making decisions either. I'm just pointing these things out, and it's mainly because the broker didn't want to reduce the fees, and neither did the escrow, for that matter. So interesting point, but 1E is a huge one. Now, this line also exists on page 10. So we'll get to that probably in a few weeks. But just so you guys know, it's in two different places on the contract. So moving right along. Okay, so there's the AD. That was actually a form that we went over last week. The agency disclosure or agency relationship disclosure. Okay, now section 2B here, okay, is the confirmation of the agencies, but it doesn't have the verbiage of the AD. So if you notice here, it says the parties each acknowledge receipt of the AD, right? So a lot of times I'll ask the other side, I'll say, hey, would you mind delivering the agency disclosure for the seller? And they say, oh no, the confirmation is on the offer. And then I'll point out to them, well, if you look at section 2A, it literally says parties each acknowledge receipt. So I need you to deliver the listing agent's AD. So, these things are contractual, and I'm simply trying to put together a DRE compliant file, guys. I'm not asking you for something because I shouldn't have it, or maybe I shouldn't see it, but stop, giving me this business about just being lazy, and I don't want to do it. It's like, come on, guys, cooperate. We're trying to find solutions, not make problems. But in terms of the brokerages now, the seller's brokerage can be a dual agent, and this is where you would mark this on the form. And then obviously if there's a buyer's broker, right? I'll be honest with you, I don't know why that's like that. How can you be a dual agent if you're the buyer's broker? So I don't ask me why. Maybe that's something that we'll see on the new form change, because obviously the buyer's broker can't be a dual agent because there's a listing broker, right? So this is where you would simply mark it. And then let's see, the buyer's agent, so both the buyer's and seller's agent are dual agent. So I don't know, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe they belong to the same brokerage, but I kind of see a misprint here in terms of how they looked at this, because obviously, the buyer's agent can't be a dual agent. But you would mark the selling broker represents the seller, the buyer's broker represents the buyer, and then the appropriate licenses here, broker's license, and the license number goes there on the right. Just make sure that when you are putting up the license number, don't rely on the MLS printout. Look them up on the DRE website and make sure that you got the appropriate numbers there, because if you don't, you might later on have to do an agency confirmation because you had a wrong digit, or maybe you put the wrong number in there. So just something to think about on that end of things, okay? So here we go in now to the PRBS. That's a form that we covered last week. And what it's saying here is we acknowledge receipt of same, and then all parties have endorsed it and signed it, right? So you can see why it's important to include the AD and the PRBS in your offer to the seller and the agent. And that's because it is contractual. The buyer and seller are signing this. They're agreeing to give these things and endorse them. And so this is the reason why, you know, we ask for delivery of these items. And we all know why, as we went over them last week, why they're important. There's information there about confidential information. There's information about proper disclosure, being honest, and your fiduciary responsibility to your client. And we want that verbiage. And so this is the reason for the forms. Any questions or comments on that? So we're actually doing pretty good. We're at 6:33 on slide 10. And as mentioned before, there's 22 slides to this presentation. So moving right along, let's go to section 3. So these are financing terms. Buyer represents that funds will be good when deposited with escrow holder, right? And there's really no need to fill any of this out, because what it says here, right, is that the buyer shall deliver deposit direct to escrow holder by electronic funds. So we all know that as being a wire. So there, unless you got a cashier's check or a personal check, there's no need to fill any of this out, okay? But you may have a different situation. So the buyer deposit with agent, buyer has given the deposit personal check. So that's kind of like an old school way of doing things. So it still gives you that option. So section 3A2 gives you the option to collect a check from your client, and then you have to put it in your broker's trust fund. And now you have some additional paperwork that you got to fill out, or actually your broker does, that they took that money in. So most of us don't do this. Most of us do not bother with checks anymore. And it's mainly because electronic funds seems to be the go-to, the popular way of doing things. So there's no need to fill any of this part out other than the part that talks about the actual amount. So on section 3A, the initial deposit, the line all the way to the right, you're going to write in the amount of the deposit that you're offering to give down as earnest money deposit, otherwise known here as the initial deposit. And as mentioned, you know, that's the kind of the old school way, right? Deposit checks, you have to give them to your broker so they can put it in their trust fund. Okay. So now we have increased deposit. Okay. So some have wondered, you know, hey, if I give a $5,000 deposit to begin with, but then later on I give an increased deposit, you know, maybe 10 days later, maybe because that's when my contingency removal's up. And it's pretty much because I like the property and I'm making my offer that much stronger because of it, right? Some parties have wondered whether or not it's part of liquidated damages. So you know, you have a situation where the buyer tries to cancel and they say, oh, well, no, the increased deposit is not included. Well, no, it is, guys. It says it right here. If the parties agree to liquidated damages in this agreement, they also agree to incorporate the increased deposit into the liquidated damage amount in a separate liquidated damages clause. Okay. So if they're going to have an increased deposit, the RID form would be something that you're going to include now to protect your client. So the listing agents, make sure that if you do use the increased deposit for whatever reason, make sure that you include the form RID with it, because it includes that deposit and makes it clear to that person, to the buyer, it makes it clear to them that that money is also exposed if you remove contingencies. So that is something to think about here when you are using section 3B, right? Make sure that you include that form. In agency, it's important to understand that you as the agent are holding the deposit for the other party in confidence. Agents should not put themselves in a position of protecting their client by its non-delivery, meaning that if you are the buyer's agent and you're telling the listing agent, hey, you know what, I have their deposit in my hand and it's in the form of a check, right? And I'll deliver it tomorrow. And I've seen this happen before. They don't show up for 3 days. Don't put yourself in that position, because two things can happen. Number one, understand that if you have an executed contract, that there could be liquidated damages. Whether or not there's contingencies, I guess, is questionable, right? But the other thing is that now you're acting outside of the rule of acting honestly with your license. So it exposes your license. So just something to think about. Any questions or comments on that? So all cash offers, right? There's no need for a loan, and it automatically makes it so there's no contingency, no loan contingency. And you'll notice that when you check that box, when you go to page 2 under the loan contingency section, it doesn't allow you to check it. Don't ask me why it doesn't check both, but if you have an all cash offer, this is pretty much automatic, right? The idea here is that they're also proofing up that cash that they're saying that they have. So guys, beware of false statements. I've seen a lot of them. I've seen Word documents with blurry credentials, proof of funds that aren't signed, proof of funds that are not from institutional organizations. If you guys are going to accept proof of funds, make sure that you're reviewing them with your client, because ultimately your client is the one that makes the decision. You can give them a recommendation. You can tell them, hey, look, I'm looking at this proof of funds, but I don't like it. It doesn't look good, but I'll leave it up to you. And if they say, you know what, I think you're right, I would ask for something else. And that could be the situation. But be careful, because proof of funds electronically can be altered. They can be false. So it's just something to think about, because what always happens a lot of times with some of these transactions is they say it's an all cash offer because you think, oh, wow, this is a great deal. These guys are coming in all cash. We'll close quickly. And then a week into the transaction, they say, oh, no, we're getting hard money after all. We get a line of credit, right? That's what they try to do. So now the seller has the option to cancel if that happens, because see, sellers can't usually cancel once they're under contract, but the seller can now threaten to cancel if that's the situation. And I think that's coming up here in terms of cooperating with the loan, and that doesn't have to cooperate if the buyer decides they want to change that situation. Okay, so now let's say that it's not an all cash offer and they're going to get a loan. Well, there's proper disclosure in terms of whether or not it's going to be conventional FHA, VA, or seller financing, right? Or assumed financing. So if there is seller financing involved, there is an addendum. Now understand, guys, that real estate agents or escrow companies cannot draw up amortization or installment notes. Okay, it has to be an attorney. So if you're getting seller financing, it has to be an attorney that draws it up, because escrow companies, can't put themselves in that position. I certainly can't put myself in that position, even though I've seen installment notes for seller financing. You can see there's no money exchange. With seller financing, typically the owner already owns the property and they're simply getting somebody in there and to make payments, otherwise known as an installment note. So that installment note is simply dictating the amount of time they're going to be paying, how much they're going to be paying, how much interest they're going to be paying. there's subordination clauses, there's foreclosure clauses, all that stuff that has to be addressed. So we are not professionals in those fields. So this form simply states that. Same thing with the assumed financing. So if there is a property that has a loan on it and the seller is willing for the person, the buyer, to assume the financing that's already on it, this is a form now that would allow them to do that. Right? So now they potentially can get a second loan. And then again, it could be seller to carry as a second. So we would address that there as well. Same thing with the assumed financing, right? And then there's the FHA VA clauses here, right? And there is the FVA, right? That would require, and the FVAC that would require the lender required repairs, smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, GFCI sockets, water heater straps, right? Those are typically things that you would see on an FHA appraisal because they're the inspector. And then the FVAC actually addresses the value of the property. So actually pretty much introducing an appraisal contingency to the entire transaction. So if it's an FHA deal, typically the lender is going to ask for what's called an amendatory clause. The FVAC now is simply at the CAR form of the amendatory clause, but understand that a lot of lenders don't even accept the CAR form. They want their own. So a lot of times the lenders will give you their own amendatory clause, right? So as a major part of any contract, financing needs to be clear to a seller. The purchase agreements categorize all the possible financing terms, types, and conditions, including additional addenda required for FHA and VA type loans, right? So already built into the contract, they're telling you, hey, if you're going to use an FHA, you need these forms, right? So any questions or comments on that? All right, sounds good. So balance of down payment or purchase agreement. So now we have further up in section 2, it talks about the earnest money deposit. It talks about a secondary deposit, right, to the initial deposit. So now it talks about the loan, how much they're going to get for the loan. The very first line on this page has the purchase price. So it's simply subtracting the earnest money deposit, the loan, right, to what's left. What's left is the balance to the purchase price. So that's going to go in here. So if you fill out the form properly, the form will fill itself out, okay? And then it totals out at the bottom on line G for the purchase price, okay? So the form kind of acts like a nice little calculator. So in the CAR website, if you use the cover page, or it says cover sheet, it's usually the very first thing at the top of the forms that pop up on the queue there when you're in zip forms. You could put these numbers in there, and I will have a presentation on that as well, okay? But you can put the numbers in there, and it will carry over to this form. All right, so that's actually page 1. So this is now moving on to page 2, okay? And you'll notice there's a date there, and that usually will be populated if you cover the very first line on page 1. This is the verification of down payment. So we are now asking the buyer with their offer to deliver to the seller written verification, right? And they have the option of including it with the offer. So if they check this box here, the verification of the down payment that they're talking about on page 1, okay, that verification would be included if the box is checked. But understand that if the box isn't checked, what they're saying is in this paragraph that they'll deliver it within 3 days after the acceptance. So now, selling agents, is that a good idea to send it 3 days afterwards? I would say no. I would say it's always best to be forthcoming. Put that verification of the down payment, which is proof of funds, put that with the offer, and then I would also include the lender approval, and that I think that's coming up next. So understand that this box exists, and that I recommend that you check the box and include the proof of funds and make sure it's legitimate. Okay. So next on section 3I now, the appraisal contingency and removal, right? You have the option to not have it contingent upon having an appraised value, which I don't recommend ever, but sometimes you have clients that have additional monies where they don't care, they just like the property. So they would have the option to say, oh no, I don't care. I'm offering this on the property and I'm gonna buy it for this, but understand that this may affect your financing. You may not be able to get financing if the appraisal doesn't come in properly and or you don't have enough money to come up with. Now, just because you have an appraisal contingency doesn't mean that you can't ask the seller to reduce the price. You still can, but just understand that they can very easily say no. You already made the agreement, and that's just how it goes. So obviously the price no less than the purchase price, right? If you're going to invoke the appraisal contingency, and its removal would simply be 17 days after the acceptance, or sometimes you'll see that the listing agents will come back and say, oh no, I'll give you 10 days. And they're just trying to rush the process, okay? But the contract, the built-in really is 17 days, which equates to about 3 weeks. So that's plenty of time to be able to get an appraisal and remove the contingency, okay? So with deposits, the balance of down payment and financing type, the final offer of the purchase price is totaled at the bottom. So that's actually the bottom of page 1, okay? Page 2 begins to discuss whether the lender or buyer will be providing proof. The appraisal is then addressed as to whether or not the buyer is requesting verification, right? So any questions or comments on that? And I put an arrow there to show where the buyer initials and the seller, okay? I think you guys know where that's at. So covering only page 1, you can tell, or who can tell me what verification you will need to be performed by the listing agent. So this is covering only page 1. Can you tell me what verification you will need to be performed by the listing agent? And it's the confirmation of the agent. You want to make sure that the agent is licensed. Okay, the AD is actually one of those confirmations. It's the agency confirmation. You're confirming that that person is an agent. You should look them up. Make sure their license is correct. Make sure that they're active, right? What documents outside the disclosure and advisories would be wise to submit with the offer? And we covered that. We went over, okay, so the pre-approval letter and the proof of funds. Okay, very good. Is there much to consider when submitting an offer to the seller? And I would say, yeah, there's a lot to consider, right? So just in the interest of moving along, we're on 650, slide 14. Obviously, there's a lot to consider. And you know, if we chose this to be our line of business, you know, we should know this stuff. And I'm not saying you should know it verbatim, because I certainly don't. I know what a lot of these things say and what they talk about, so it's easy for me to reference. But if you were to ask me to dictate what each line says, I can't do that, and I won't. Okay, I'm not asking you guys to memorize any of that. Okay, and yeah, Karen, good point. Okay, so Karen's saying talk to the listing agent before writing an offer. That's like, you know what? Any wise agent is going to be able to communicate what it is that the sentiment of your buyer. You know, communicate these things, because you know, I had a situation today where they did a final walkthrough, and one of the things that the seller was supposed to do wasn't done yet, and the agent flipped out. he wrote this nasty email to the escrow to hold $500, you know, from the listing agent, which he can't do, by the way. Remember, we just talked about that with section 1E, right? They wrote an addendum to hold $500, and they wanted us to sign it. And all he had to do was talk to the listing agent. Guess what? They did the final walkthrough, I think, on Monday. Tuesday, what it was there was a big hole in the ceiling for the air intake for the air conditioner, and the filter had come loose, so the owner threw it away. Okay, so what happened was they had to special order a new one because of the size of it. It was an older one. They don't make them anymore, so you can't just go to Home Depot and get a new one. So they actually took the time and spent the money on getting a new one because they knew that he was a little upset about it. Okay, and because he didn't talk to the agent, he didn't know that they just put it up. So literally 10 minutes after they sent that nasty email, the listing agent goes, "Hey, what are you talking about? It's done. Here's a picture of it, and it looks super nice." And so simply just talking would avoid so much stress and so much lack of anger that you might have towards it. So just talk, guys. I mean, it's so simple. So good point, Karen. And I gave an example on that, right? Because just simply talking is part of aggressive negotiations, right? Being aggressive doesn't necessarily mean being aggressive. It means communicating. It means being diplomatic. Okay. So any questions on what we covered on page 1 so far? Comments? All right, so let's move on to page 2. So now we're on loan terms, right? So the loan applications, the buyer shall deliver to seller a letter from the buyer's lender, which typically is a loan approval or pre-qualification, which are different, by the way. A pre-qualification is simply a letter from the lender saying that, hey, this person looks like they look pretty good based on what they're telling me. Whereas a pre-approval means that this person has now given them tax returns and a lot of the information that they need to look at, where an underwriter has actually looked at it and given a pre-approval now on the loan, which means they're not quite approved yet, but they have looked at most of the information. Whereas pre-qualified means that they haven't gotten the information. This is just what they're being told. So understand that there's two different things. And then, of course, is that letter attached? Is the pre-approval attached? Do I recommend putting that letter of approval on your offer? Absolutely, along with your proof of funds. And you might even go an extra mile and include the FICO scores, not the entire credit report, just the FICO score page, to show them why the lender came up with their pre-approval and or pre-qualification, because they actually saw their FICO scores. Yes, we did pull this person's credit, and here are their FICO scores. Here's their proof of funds, and here's their lender pre-approval or pre-qualification. Make sense, guys? So we move on to loan contingency, right? So the buyer's qualification, right? So buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement. Wow. Buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement. You know, I'll be honest with you guys, I'm speechless. I'll say it again. Buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement. I don't know. I'll have to come back to that. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one. I mean, if any of you guys have any comments on that, I'll welcome it, right? But I don't understand what that means. So loan contingency removal, right? So typically within 21 days, which is a hard 3 weeks, but can be changed, obviously. The buyer can remove the loan contingency or cancel the agreement within that time frame, right? And this is the part that I was saying on section J4 here, is that when we go back to cash offer, it says is that there's no loan contingency, but see, maybe this isn't a cash offer and there is no loan contingency. So meaning that they're pretty sure they're going to get a loan, so they remove the loan contingency. The only reason why I would suggest doing that is if the person really, really likes this property and they want to make this a strong offer. So I would not check this box otherwise. I would leave it open to protect the buyer as your client. Okay. Simply my never to be humble opinion, but you guys, can rate and weigh the situation in terms of how you're dealing with your clients, but that would be, an option now. So so far we have the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency, or if you're dealing with a cash offer, no loan contingency, right? So lender limits of buyer's credits, right? There shall be no automatic adjustment to the purchase price to make up for the difference between contractual credit and lender allowable credit. So what they're saying is that you can't adjust the purchase price based on the lender credit. So I won't get into that too much. Too bad, or I actually, oh no, we don't have a lender here that could explain that, but at the end of the day, there are lender credits and sometimes they give them back, sometimes they don't. But at the end of the day, the contract is saying pretty much it's a non-allowable, okay? And some of you may have heard that term before, where there shall be no automatic adjustment to the purchase price. So because the buyer isn't officially approved for a loan until they actually apply, it is necessary to address the application delay and process. Timeframes given are usually appropriate, but can be changed and or extended. Loan approval can make or break a deal for different reasons, okay? So I'm not going over this word for word, guys. I'll let you guys, read the bulk of it, but I did want to outline the specifics of each of these paragraphs, okay? So understand that that's the nature of the presentation. So like I always say, do yourself a favor, pick up the form and read it, right? And if it's just one page a day, that's okay. Matter of fact, sometimes I'll take a page and I'll read it 3 times before I go to the next page. And it's just one time. I'm just reading it. I'm not studying it. I'm not memorizing it. None of that stuff. All I'm doing is just reading it. And it gave me the ability to understand it enough to where I can do this presentation. But I still can't wrap my head around section J2, where it says buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies to this agreement. So why wouldn't they be? I mean, I guess I'm having a hard time with that. I'm going to have to ask somebody that I know. There's a gentleman by the name of Louis Acala. He actually used to help the attorneys at Carr write this. So I'm curious to see if that's going to come up on the new contract, right? Let's see, and we'll be able to study this together. And again, this is the reason why I wanted to go over this presentation with the old RPA before the new one comes in, so we can contrast the two, okay? So any questions or comments on that? Oh, my back is giving me problems here. So let's move on to section 3K. So buyer stated financing, sellers relying on buyer's representation. So all cash, amount of down payment, or contingent or non-contingent loan. Seller has no obligation. Oh, okay, this is the part that I was telling you about. The seller has no obligation to cooperate with the buyer's efforts to obtain any financing other than specified in the agreement. So if the buyer's coming in and saying, yeah, I'm getting FHA loan, or no, let's do a different example. No, buyer comes in and says, I'm doing an all cash offer on this property, and then 10 days later come and say, oh, you know what? They're going to do an appraisal on the property, and it's like, wait a minute, you said it was an all cash loan. I said, yeah, but I decided to go with the lender, right? So the seller has no obligation to cooperate. They can say no. First of all, there's no appraisal contingency because that's what you check. And number 2, there's no loan contingency. So if you can't get a loan, it's not my problem. So it says the availability of any such alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation And let me see if it moves on. Yeah. So any obligation to purchase the property, right? So meaning that, hey, you put the offer in, now you're obligated to purchase based on the way that you said. So moving on to section 4, if the buyer, so let's see, so this agreement, the buyer's ability to obtain financing are not contingent upon the sale of the property owned by the buyer, okay? Unless they check section B, where they actually submit the form COP, where this agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing are contingent upon the sale of property owned by the buyer, meaning that they have to sell a piece of property and use those proceeds now to come to our property now and buy this property. I have to use, let's say I'm going to get $100,000 from a property that I'm selling, but it's not closed yet. Okay, so once that closes, I'm bringing that 100,000 over here so I can put it down on this property. So if that's a situation, you're going to use the COP, right? And then you check that box. But the contract is giving you the option, right, for that. So now Karen's asking a question. Sorry, this is a previous page. Can you get EMD back if you cancel agreement because of the appraisal and loan contingency? And yeah, if you haven't removed contingencies, right, your earnest money deposit is not exposed. But yes, that's the purpose of a contingency. If it didn't appraise or can't obtain a loan, yes, that's the purpose of a loan contingency. Is, hey, I can't get a loan after all, sorry, because obviously you can't apply for a loan until you have something under contract. The lender won't allow it unless you know somebody, right? But yeah, that's the purpose of the contingency, is to protect your earnest money deposit. Okay, so until you have released the contingencies, that's the only time that you're exposed. Now, you're not going to release contingencies until, of course, you have the appraisal and the appraisal come in at value. And then your lender's telling you that you have a loan approval. And typically it's in writing. Typically they're emailing it to you and yeah, you're approved. Typically it's called a conditional approval, meaning that there's a few things that they might need. But looking at it, you're saying, oh yeah, I can get those things for them because I already know my client has those. And you ask them for it and you get it to them, okay? But you can potentially remove contingencies, but not until then is your buyer's or your client's earnest money deposit exposed, meaning that if they not try to cancel, now they can lose their deposit. So now, so if you don't have down payment and closing costs, you can't get your EMD back. Is this an issue? So I'm not sure I understand that, because if you don't have the down payment, right, and money for the closing costs, how did you get an approval? How did you provide that information to the listing agent and the seller? Because that is required information. We saw it on the very part of page 2. I was thinking of that line you highlighted in red. I am puzzled too. If you spent the money, oh, if you spent it, okay. Well, hey, you know what? That is not a good situation. And a lot of you that have done transactions with me, I have what's called an ABA, or affiliated business arrangement, and then the rest of it says, and realtor capacity disclosure, okay? And in that section, we talk about, hey, Mr. Buyer, you're in the process of purchasing a home. Do not go out and purchase a car or large items, because it does two things. Number one, you're spending money that you probably don't have, and that you're not spending in two places. You can't buy a house with this money and go buy a car too, or both, okay? That's one thing. But the other thing is it's going to affect your credit. And remember, we pulled your credit in order for you to qualify for this loan, and you may not qualify anymore. So these are things that we're warning our client about. We're warning them to say, don't do these things. So yeah, if you are putting your best foot forward and you're showing proof of funds, right, that money should not be moved. That money is there for a purpose, and it's there for a reason. And we are in the middle of a project with a purchase agreement purchasing a home. So I hope that answers your question. Because yeah, if you have a problem with a client saying, oh yeah, I have $50,000 I don't put on a property, but then all of a sudden they only have 30 because they spent 20 of it, that's bad news. And definitely as their agent, as their acquaintance / friend, you tell them up front, do not spend this money, right? So now we get into section 5 where, we talk about the addenda, and there obviously is a lot here that can be checked, and it really is just depending on the nature of your transaction. Okay, so if you're writing on this offer and that they're telling you, well, we already accepted an offer, but if you guys want to be a backup offer, then you would use the BUO, right? Any additional addenda. So let's say that you didn't use the right purchase agreement, so you need some addenda to clarify some things, like say tenant in possession or some maybe a rent back of some kind. Okay, these could be things can be addressed with addenda. Okay, then then there's the court confirmation addenda where again, maybe you use the RPA and it's a probate and they need court confirmation. There's a CCA, right? There's a septic and well property monument addendum that you can use, short sale addendum, the buyer's inspection advisory you're always going to use, so that's always going to be checked, right? You have the probate advisory, the trust advisory, the REO that we talked about a little bit in last week's presentation, and also the short sale information addendum, which is actually more of a disclosure. It's an advisory, but that's not something that's contractual. The SSA is the one that's contractual. That one actually has timeframes and some other things that you would include in the contract. But these are additional addenda that you could add into these contracts depending on your situation. So familiarize yourself with these. Know that you can use them and use them appropriately. It's kind of like putting in the puzzle pieces. This is a backup offer. I'm using the BUO. This is foreclosed property. I'm using the REO. It's a trust property. Guess what? I'm using the trust advisory, right? These are all just puzzle pieces that you're putting in. So why is it important to mention what the buyer's intent is to purchase and the type of financing, right? And that's because the seller doesn't have to cooperate. That's why it's important to mention what kind of financing you're getting. You don't want to change it. The use of an additional contingency sometimes is necessary if the buyer is in need of selling another property. That's the COP, right? That's the section right there, section 4B, where if the seller has to sell another property, it becomes a contingency, meaning that the buyer doesn't lose their deposit if they can't sell their property. They have the right to cancel, and that COP has that verbiage. Now, here's the question. Does this weaken the offer to the seller? Because yeah, we're making an offer to a property here. Does that weaken it? Yeah, absolutely, because there's that possibility that you might have to cancel because you're adding a contingency. So typically you have 3. You have the appraisal, the investigation, and the loan contingency, but now you're adding a 4th contingency, which is that the buyer has to sell their property. So it becomes a weaker offer for that reason. So if you have 2 similar offers, but one of them has a COP and the other one doesn't, obviously the one that doesn't is usually going to be the one that says, well, we're going to go with this one because this guy over here, they got to sell their property, and there's less guarantee that that's going to happen, right? So any questions or comments on that slide? All right, we're 7:10, and we're coming up on slide 17, so we're looking pretty good. Let's move on to section 6. So any terms that have not already been addressed can be placed here. Now, a lot of times what I see here is, talking about closing costs. I see here about changing commissions. I see different things like that. Understand, guys, that if you're changing commissions, you have to get the seller's permission. If you do not get the seller's permission when you're changing commissions, it could be a violation of MLS rules as well as the contractual rules. It's a violation of MLS rules because when you're changing commissions, typically the commissions, they have to be realized by the seller, not the listing agent. Because a lot of times what you see is that you see the buyer saying, oh, you know what, you're offering 2.5%, but I'll take 2%. And the listing agent saying, oh, okay, cool. You know, I was supposed to get 2.5%, but now I get 3%. That's not how it works. That's a violation. So understand that if that's what's going to happen, the listing agent needs the seller's permission. So I recommend having an addendum simply saying that. If the intention is for the savings to go to the seller, then you have to make it clear, okay? Don't just write it in here that, you know, hey, selling agents reducing commissions to 2%, because that's what I've seen, right? The listing agent tells escrow, oh, guess what? I'm getting 3% now, and the selling agent's getting 2%, right? The seller doesn't even know a lot of times what's even going on, even though they're reading it, because to them, they signed on for a 5% commission. So guess what? It's 5% total. That's all they care about. But what they don't realize is that 0.5% was supposed to go back to them, and it didn't. Don't get caught up in that, okay, guys? Make sure that if you're going to modify the commissions, there is a form that you can use. It's called the CBC, but also you can write an addendum if the savings is supposed to be realized by the seller, okay? Don't just write it in section 6, which I've seen it, okay? So the other thing that I've seen is here, allocation of costs, okay? So a lot of times I'll see on page 1 under financing, it says seller to pay $5,000 of buyer's closing costs, right? Is that a financing term? Or I'll add this, or is that a cost? So under financing term, and let me just go back there real quick. Let me see if I can get back to it quickly. Oh, didn't realize that many highlights out here, but I think this is rather important. So right there, section E at the very top, okay, it says additional financing terms. I'll see in here, it'll say seller to pay $5,000 of buyer's closing costs. Is that a financing term? Anybody? Or is it a cost? Okay. Okay. It's a cost. Boy, it took a little bit to squeeze it out of you, but Karen is correct. It is not a financing term, it's a cost. Okay, so I'm gonna just fast forward here for a second. Okay, just let me get back to where we were. And I think it was here. Okay. Take a look at, well, we'll go through this part first, and I'll get back to that. Okay, just because it's the next page, and I'm pretty sure it's there. Yeah. Okay. So this I literally had a conversation today with an agent about. Okay, so allocation of costs. Okay, so this is where financing, if you're going to want the seller to pay $5,000 in closing costs, it's actually going to be on the next slide down. Okay, so we'll come back to that. So when we're talking about allocation of costs, section A talks about inspections, reports, and certificates. Okay, and I'm highlighting here, okay, where it says it does not determine who is to pay for any work recommended or identified in the report. So quick story. Okay, we're at 7:15, so we're coming up to the end here. So I'll just to give you guys a quick story. Some of you have heard this already, but just for the purposes of the recording, I'll be quick. In Northern California, there was a seller that signed what was called a WPA, or wood destroying pest addendum. Some of us that are old enough know and are familiar with that addendum. Well, they got rid of it. And the reason why is because the seller had signed it and the termite had come back at $60,000. And the seller said, I'm not paying that. So obviously it ended up in court, and moving, kind of fast forwarding, the judge had decided that he agreed with the seller. And the reason why is because the seller signed that addendum before he knew how much it was, which makes sense, okay? So what they did was they got rid of the addendum, and what they did was they moved the entire termite request onto the request for repairs. So if you look at the request for repairs form, there's a section that talks about termite. So this is where you would request it, okay? But this is why they put here in bold type. It does not determine who's to pay for the work recommended, identified in the report. So here, most of us put seller to pay for natural hazard disclosure. Well, that's pretty typical because, you know, the seller usually, it's required, and the seller usually pays for that. It's $100, right? Well, the next lines are blank. It says buyer or seller shall pay for the following report. Typically, in that one says termite. And then I see very cleverly the agents say termite report and clearance. So understand that just above in bold type, it says does not determine who's to pay. So guess what? Just because the seller agreed to pay for the clearance, if that termite comes back at $8,000 and the seller goes, I ain't paying that, he would be justified. And guess what, guys? There is legal precedence that if that ends up in court and it'll end up in small claims, there's legal precedence that the seller would win that argument. He doesn't have to pay for it. So don't get caught up in that, guys. We can talk about the tricks of how to deal with that later on, but understand that you can only ask for the report here. It does not determine who's to pay. So don't think you're going to be clever and say, and clearance. Now, do a lot of agents know and understand what I just said? No. So a lot of you get away with it. And the sellers are more than happy to say, okay, yeah, I'll pay for the clearance, no problem. Sometimes the sellers have plenty of money where they don't even care. But I don't think that's the point. The point is that we understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, okay? So just a quick little nugget for today's training, okay? So section B talks about water heater bracing, carbon monoxide detectors, and smoke detectors, right? And it says if required, okay? And in the state of California, guess what? They are required. So do yourself a favor, mark buyer or seller, doesn't matter, whoever you decide. Typically, it's going to be the seller that's going to take care of that stuff. And there's also addenda that goes out and disclosure that goes out on those same things. And well, Sully and Robert, when you say everything is negotiable, I think you're talking about what I was just talking about in terms of the termite. And yeah, absolutely. And it's mainly because you're going to make that request. Okay, so now you have the termite report in hand. You're going to deliver it to the seller, and you can say, hey, Mr. Seller, the termite's $8,000, but you're going to include a request for repairs asking for the seller to do it now. Now they do have a copy of the report, and now they can decide whether or not they're going to pay for it. And guess what? They can say no. Yeah. So that's pretty much, Karen's pretty much saying it. I suggest get the seller to agree to fix repair termite after seller knows how much it costs. Yeah, and that's the process. They have to see the termite report first. So that's the process of getting them to agree to do it. And that's the reason why it's on the request for repairs. That's the reason why you can't put and clearance here, because if you try to put their feet to the fire and take them to court, you'll lose. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Ultimately, the nugget here is that you might be clever enough to think that as long as they agreed to it and they signed it, that they must now have to go through with it. No, I'm telling you that there's legal precedence to the latter, that they do not have to pay for it if it comes back at an undesirable amount. Now, let's just say it comes back at $1,500 and they're okay with it. Then you know what? There's no problem. I'm just talking about the times when it comes back and it's crazy amount like 12,000, and the seller said, I didn't know it was that much. I ain't paying for it. They would have legal precedence to back them up. So just understand that that's the situation. Okay. So moving on to the governmental section, section B, right? Carbon monoxide detectors, smoke detectors, and water heater straps, right? There's state requirements. There's a lot of homes that have the tankless water heaters, which now, don't require that. But there is a height requirement with those. So just know that there is a height requirement. I think, oh, Celia knows about that one. We had an inspector tell us that the tankless water heater was a bit low, right? So that was one of the things that we had encountered on one of the inspections, right? Yeah, I remember that. That was an interesting little nugget there that I had no idea. I figured, they could pretty much put it anywhere, but apparently not. There are requirements for those things too. Okay, so one of the most misunderstood parts of this contract is Section 7. It actually says in bold type, it does not determine who's to pay. How can the parties agree if they don't know how much it will cost? And ultimately, that's the legal precedence. The seller can agree to something that they don't know what it costs. Okay, so understand that part of the contract, Section 7. On the listing side, you can be clever. On the selling side, you can also be clever. And I'll go over some of that when we're actually talking about that in a different presentation. Any questions or comments? Oh, well, unless otherwise agreed in writing, and I think I deliberately highlighted that, right? Where there has been situations, and I have a few on the board right now, where the seller does know because they had some termite work done like 8 months prior to them selling the property, and they had a clearance, and they actually produced it. So can the seller at that point say, no, it's okay, I'll take care of it. I have a company that comes yearly and they treat the property. There are some diligent sellers out there that do that, and so that would be the lighter side of all this. I just wanted to show you guys what it actually says and what the legal precedence is, so you can appropriately represent your client, because that's what you want to do. What are we really after here, guys? We're after referrals, and if you know what you're doing and don't get caught up in these contractual predicaments, right? You come off as knowing what you're doing, you're going to get referrals. And that's ultimately what we're after. Okay. So any other questions or comments on that? Then obviously the initial at the bottom of the page, that was the bottom of page 2. So now section 7B2. So the cost of compliance now, it talks about inspections and reports. And the funny thing about this section is I have had some agents confuse when it talks about government retrofit standards, inspections, and reports. I've had them confuse that with government lending. Guys, this has absolutely nothing to do with the lender, FHA or VA. Absolutely nothing to do with that, okay? This has to do with the city or the municipality, okay? So what's important here is that we see on section 2(1) or I, okay, here, right after here, inspections and reports. And I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, okay? And actually, let me do something here because this is kind of important. I'm gonna highlight this real quick. It says right here, it says if required. Everybody see that? Right there, if required, as a condition of closing escrow, right? Those 2 words right there, if these boxes are checked, okay, only apply if it's required as a condition of closing escrow. That's it. Only if it's required. So if you happen to see these checked, if you're the listing agent, and I've seen listing agents freak out, well, they'll put, oh, section 7(2) is deleted from this contract. They don't need to do that. Like if you're, say you're here in the city of Whittier does not require compliance, inspections, reports, right? Or government retrofitting. They don't require it here in the city of Whittier. So guess what? If it's required, those are the 2 words, right? So understand that if these boxes are checked, the seller is not held liable, or the buyer, just depending on what box you check. They're not held liable for these things unless it's required. Like, let's say in the city of Los Angeles, they require a 9A report. It's called a pre-sale inspection report. It's a 9A. You have other types of inspection reports that are like City of Southgate, okay, that do require. So if these boxes are checked, guess what? They have to be taken care of. Now, the city does require it. Now, let's just talk about Southgate for a second. If these things are not taken care of within 18 months, they're going to penalize the owner of the property. And now that becomes the person who purchased the property. They purchased the property, and now they're liable for any government retrofitting or inspections or fees that are not to code to that city standards. Long Beach has like a parking garage inspection that they do, right? So there are lists that you can find on the internet that talk about these pre-sale inspections depending on the city. They have different types. So understand that this section here is only if required. So if you happen to check them or not, you know, you should be looking before you write the offer of whether or not it's required. Because if it's not, you can strengthen your offer, but not freaking the listing agent out and just leave them blank. If, let's say you're here in the city of Whittier, leave them blank. But if you're in Southgate, I would mark seller. Or talk to the agent about it. Talk to the listing agents, what we talked about earlier, right? Always wise to talk to the agent. Hey, has your client gone to the city yet to find out anything about the pre-sale inspection? Oh yeah, we already took care of it. Oh good, so I can just mark seller and there's no problem. And they can produce it. But the point is that you know what this is. Has nothing to do with the FHA loans or VA loans. Guys, we all understand that FHA stands for Federal Housing Administration. We all understand that VA stands for Veterans Administration. Those are government entities. But understand that that's not government financing. That's government insurance. They're insuring the loan. So you have to follow their guidelines. That has nothing to do with government inspections and reports and retrofitting. Two different things altogether. So understand the difference. One of them is government insurance for loans. The other one is municipal, which is also government, which is the city, right? Municipal or local government inspections, reports, and guidelines. So now that you know that, you guys just got a big nugget, because believe it or not, I've had brokers put weird comments about this section, and I'm telling them, hey guys, that has nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. They're putting comments there about FHA and VA. It's like, excuse me, that has nothing to do with this section. Nothing. It's about cities. This is the city. So moving on, I'm getting too passionate about that one. I'm getting all heated up on that one, because that one is definitely a point of contention. So here we have escrow and title. Buyer and seller shall pay, and obviously because they have fees, you know, it should be talked about, you know, who's going to pay the fees and why, right? Typically, it's each their own. Typically, the seller's choice, right? It's actually saying here that the parties are going to, within 5 days after receipt of the escrow stuff, that they're going to return the general provisions back to escrow. Does that always happen? Ooh, rarely. I would say that happens rarely. They sit on that stuff. Don't ask me why, but they do. And then it talks about the title insurance. Who's the title insurance company going to be? And then who's going to pay for it? Typically, the seller pays for the owner's title policy. But now there's a lender title policy, and Larry's possibly going to correct me right now, where there's the lender policy is typically the ALTA, and the owner's policy is called the CLTA, which is California Land Title Association, and then the ALTA is American Land Title Association. But they're different kinds of insurance. One of them is for the owner and one of them is for the buyer. Okay. I'm sorry, for the lender. Okay, so the contracts very specifically says that the buyer shall pay for any title insurance policy insuring the buyer's lender. So the seller can't pay that. And so that's automatic. But can the buyer pay for an owner's policy? And the answer would be yes. So it gives them that option. So understand that there are two different things going on here. One of them you're forced into, and the other one you can make the decision. So some have asked, why is it important that section 7B1 be addressed? And so we talked about that in depth. I think I over talked on that one. Some areas of cities do not require inspections or reports and are not always addressed. Why is it important for 7C1C to be considered? And that's because nobody ever returns that information. So we are on slide coming up on slide 19, so I'll go a little quicker here. We're at 732. So I do apologize, I got a little long-winded on section 7B. So, okay, guys, this is where we were talking about, remember we were talking about additional financing costs? If you're going to ask for seller to pay $5,000 of buyer's non-recurring closing costs, you could put it on section D8. Here on this section. That's where that would go, because it's a cost. It's not a financing term. So we want the seller to pay that cost, and we talked about it with the listing agent and they're okay with it. It would go on 78. That's the appropriate place. Now, just because you put it on additional terms or even on section 6, you know, that one section that just lets you write whatever you want, it still works, but where's the appropriate place? Under other costs, 7D8, okay? I say that passionately because I rarely see it done properly, and sometimes it creates confusion, right? So here we have the option to allocate the cost, buyer or seller, for county transfer tax, for city transfer tax, which doesn't always exist, HOA transfer fees, which don't always exist, but again, buyer or seller can pay. Now, it's actually forcing seller shall pay HOA fees for preparing the documents, so you don't have that decision, right? And then the buyer to pay for the HOA certification fee. So you don't have that option to weed that off to the seller, okay? But the rest of them you do, okay? And it talks about a civil code there, 4525, which is the proper disclosure. And understand on section 10F that if there is an HOA, the HOA documents now become a contingency to the transaction. So we talked about 4 contingencies already. We talked about loan, appraisal, investigation, and then we talked about the buyer to have to sell a property. Well, that's a 5th one now, the HOA. So most of us are familiar with loan, appraisal, and investigation, or some people call it inspection, but it's actually investigation because it's a lot of different things. But HOA becomes a 5th one that's possible, okay? And then we get into the home warranty, buyer or seller to pay, and then the cost. It's always wise to go onto the home warranty systems if you're going to ask for a home warranty, and find out the one that you're looking for and find out how much it costs so you can put the proper cost there. As a matter of fact, you can even put a little more because it says not to exceed, okay? And then obviously if there's a pool, you can ask for additional coverage and or air conditioning. Now, the one that I see always people putting on other is roof. And I can pretty much tell you that there is no home warranty company that has a full roof warranty that they cover. It's just a tune-up. So when they talk about a roof warranty, it's like $50, and they're gonna replace a couple of tiles maybe, but they're not gonna fix the whole roof. Don't mislead your client, your buyer, to think that if they get a home warranty and there seems to be some roof problems already, like maybe there's a stain in the ceiling or something like that, I can pretty much tell you guys, and please do your own research, I can pretty much tell you that a roof coverage is only a few, it's just a tune-up. It's only a few tiles, if that, or a patchwork, okay? So don't kid yourself in thinking that if you're gonna add roof there, that it's gonna be something big, because it's not, okay? And then obviously they have the option to waive that. So I have seen these contracts come over where it says, you know, the cost of the warranty, but neither of the boxes is checked. Well, who's going to pay for it? Well, we don't have an agreement for it because there was no box check. It should be addressed in a counteroffer usually, but even then it's missed. Then it has to be an addendum, but it has to be somewhere because escrow needs to know who to charge it to. Okay. And then this section allows you to add any other fees that you may want to address, like TC or assisted fees. Home warranties are not required, but they do cost money. So the decision on who to pay or whether or not there should be one is decided here. And so that gives you the option to check the box, buyer or seller, okay? And then obviously my favorite one, section 7D9, which should always be transaction coordinator fee for a buyer of $450. And I put for a buyer there because I didn't want to check the box, okay? But you would check the box, and then this is where you would put my fee if you're going to use me, obviously. If you put that in there, I don't have to use an authorization now with the client. I can just give escrow an invoice and reference this section, and the buyer and seller have already agreed to the fee. It's kind of nice. Any questions or comments on that? Actually, Karen, I should just use Alex for your TC needs. He's awesome, and I will help you. Well, I appreciate that, Karen. You know, I've put myself in that position, guys. I enjoy helping other people, whether it be buyers or sellers or other agents. You know, I've been in the business coming up, believe it or not, in February, it'll be 33 years in different capacities, but I really do enjoy helping other agents. And, you know, when I see the files right now that I've got, the majority of agents, they have a hard time with these contracts. They have a hard time with understanding what some of the guidelines are on how to do things. So understand that because we're talking about it, you're slowly learning these things, and as you're doing them, some of it's going to click and you're going to remember, and it's going to help you. Believe me when I say, and I can tell you from experience, my own personal experience, that if you know what you're doing and you know how to do it, it's going to give you more business. And that's the purpose of listening to this, is really just to get more business. Because can you get somebody like me to write your contracts and to go to the disclosures with the client and do all that stuff? Yeah, and you can pay the fee. But guess what? They're going to pretty much know that you're kind of pushing things off to someone else. Think of it like this. Let's say you hired an attorney, and all the attorney does is say, oh, you know what? Talk to my paralegal, talk to my paralegal, talk to my paralegal. At some point, you're going to say, hey, does this guy even know what he's doing? I know I would. So this is the reason why you don't want to just depend on somebody, an assistant, not even a broker. You know, depend on yourself to know this stuff. This was your decision, your career decision. So read it. And like I said, that's all I did. Okay, yeah, I researched some of it just because I had questions. But guess what? Most of it is just reading the contract and understanding it, because it's in plain English. You know, it's not rocket science what the car attorneys have put on these forms for us. So do yourself a favor, and like I said, piecing it together like this is kind of nice. But the analogy that I give is a chessboard, and each piece on the chessboard moves differently. And if you know how those pieces move, and your opponent does not, you're going to win the game every time. And that's true about these contracts, because some of it is where, you know, you want to win something over. Like, let's say you want to reduce the price, or you want to get some work done and stuff like that. If you know how the contracts work, you're going to win the game. That's the other part of it. And if you win the game, you end up looking like Superman to your client. And your client is not going to refer you to family, friends, acquaintances, right? Or even themselves again. Hey, you know what? You sold me this property 8 years ago. Can you help me sell it now? I've gotten some of those. So understand, folks, that this is the reason why, number one, I'm trying to help show you guys these things. But the other part of it is to get more business. It's not just about having the knowledge and the know-how. It's really the profit behind it. because this happened to be our career choice. And yeah, we want to make money doing it. This is a piece of the puzzle. Obviously, marketing is another piece. You want to get into that heavily. Remember, consistency is the key. And I highlighted that part. That's my favorite. Any questions or comments on that? Oh, look, I did exit. Okay, good. Okay, so we're at 7:41, so we're not too much over. Slide number 20. So pages 1 and 2 address the most pertinent parts of the transaction, price, financing, and one of the contingencies. There are actually, it's 2 of them, or actually, no, 3. I'm surprised I've only put 1 there. There are 8 other pages of further terms and conditions that still need to be addressed. After looking at these 2 pages, it seems a bit overwhelming that there is more. Not only is it necessary, but appropriate to include this much in a purchase contract. The writers of these contracts have taken the necessary steps to try and ensure that all the bases are covered. As always, the intent of the contracts is to protect all parties, being sure that the seller discloses all material facts known to them and that the buyer acknowledges them. The cost of purchasing is addressed and agreed to, and that the appropriate professionals are hired to further inform the buyer, allowing the ability to proceed, renegotiate, or cancel the transaction. I will continue to say this. I visualize the contract as being a chess game. If you know how the pieces move on the board, you can make your contractual moves with calculation and precision. These are of a true professional in aggressive negotiations. And as always, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. So I say that because it's all in writing and it's endorsed by both parties. It's executed. That is what's the important part. You can reference this now. If somebody comes up and tells you something, oh no, that's not what it says. This is what it says. Man, they get mad when you show them like that. They get pissed off. And I'm certainly not trying to piss anybody off, but man, it says what it says. Guess what? It's checkmate on the chessboard. You just won the game. So a little bit long today, guys. I do apologize, but good presentation as far as I'm concerned. You know what? I didn't update this page today. I kind of ran out of time, so I do apologize. I forgot to put Shamim's information in here. So there's the regular stuff. As a matter of fact, there's Dave's old information. But if you guys want Dave's stuff, hopefully some of you had taken a picture of it or something before. If not, contact me. I'll get it for you. That said, we will move on to part 3 of this presentation, which will be, I want to say pages 3, 4, and it's probably just pages 3 and 4 next week, and some other stuff. So other than that, trying to get past these. Once we get past these 6, I'll move on to the real estate listing part. I don't know if there's going to be any changes on the listing agreement, but in terms of the purchase agreement, we are expecting to change in December. So that said, any questions or comments on what we talked about today? A lot of stuff today, actually. Good presentation. So we're at 7:44. You're welcome, Karen, anytime. Believe it or not, I got more stuff to do, so I'll be here a little bit later tonight. Robert, so it's always a pleasure to have you guys. Don't apologize. You are doing us a favor, and thank you for an amazing class. Yeah, and it's my pleasure, guys. It really is. I really do wish there was more people that I come in contact with that know the contracts. I certainly don't write them, so I'm not, out there, waving the car flag saying, hey, this is how it should be. No, I'm simply relaying to you guys the business we're in. So should we all be on the same page? I think we should. And guess what? A lot of times, if we're on the same page, and a lot of times I do come across agents that are, it's kind of nice because now we have a nice little relationship going, and we get what we need done. It's no argument. There's no angst. There's no anger. There's no anxiety. There's none of that. So, yeah, Victoria, thank you for coming on. I hope it was helpful. Melissa, of course. Still looking for your email, so let me know when you're available. Next week, like I mentioned before, we'll be doing part 3. I'll try and get to it, make sure that I scrub it before we present it for next week. Again, the only thing that was missing here was Shamim's information for property ID, but you guys have seen it before. It obviously won't be on the recording, but it'll be available hopefully next week. So that's it, guys. Unless there's anything else, I'll be signing off. Larry, you're welcome. I appreciate you coming on. Like I said, unless there's anything else, I'll be signing off. You guys are welcome to email me or call me during the week anytime if you have questions or comments. Any of the transactions you're working on, I'll be more than happy to help you with that stuff. And as always, your broker is always also a good source of information. But if they're not, and you know you happen to need my help, hey, don't fret. You know, giving me a call. I had an agent, you know, I think she was here last week, telling me that she didn't want to call me because she was embarrassed because, you know, she's not with a brokerage that I'm familiar with. And it doesn't matter. I'm not with a brokerage. You know what I mean? That doesn't matter to me, right? So Karen made a comment. I'm happy to help anyone too with anything. A loan originator. Oh, okay, so Karen's a loan originator, a realtor, and notary public in Coachella Valley. So actually, that's kind of good to know because, you know, going out that direction, now some of us fall short with services, right? If you have any questions, I might be able to help you with. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Call Alex, right? So have a great evening. So there's something that might be helpful if you guys want to. But other than that, I'll see you guys next week. Hopefully that was helpful for this week. And we'll be doing part 3. So we'll be 50% done after next Wednesday. All right, guys. So you guys have a nice evening, and we'll talk to you then, okay?